Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to be venturing to where the cryptids lie, skinwalkers, and all the horrors that await us in the middle of nowhere. So get comfortable, have your protective charms at the ready, and let the darkness take control. Normally, I am completely stoic and don't care for superstition or anything like that. But this incident was different. I am a grown-ass man, but moments ago, I started sobbing uncontrollably and got so nauseous I puked my dinner. I don't know what the hell is going on, but after listening to some of these encounters, it was like something inside me just clicked. And then I remembered. For background, I was a weird little kid, incredibly full of energy and supposedly really smart. I loved spending all day outside, roaming the foothills and getting lost, then finding my way home. I was totally fearless, and it really pissed my parents off, because of course they would get worried sick about me if I didn't come home on time, or even until after dark. You see, I loved exploring, finding the hidden places and searching for interesting animals and bugs. My parents were convinced that I was going to grow up to be a scientist of some kind. Yet, I had a sort of lack of respect for authority, and my constant failure to return on time resulted in some pretty serious groundings. My solution was simple. I would stop going out in the daytime and instead start sneaking out at night. My nocturnal adventures began when I was about 12 years old, and my range quickly increased from the neighborhood to the nearby golf course to the deep woods outside of town. I would sneak out about midnight and try and be home before 4 or 5, just before my dad woke up. I would use my morning shower to clean up, then stumble off to school like a zombie. Needless to say, my grades suffered, and discipline measures became even stricter. Still, nobody could stop me from sneaking out and having my adventures in the night. This went on for years, and I never felt afraid, even when the cops were called on me occasionally, or someone shot off a gun, or after a huge buck stared me down after I stumbled upon a bunch of deer asleep. I even heard a cougar scream once, very close by, and that got my heart pounding. But I never felt true terror. A sort of startled alertness, maybe. But the total dark wilderness never held power over me. I felt powerful and vital, like I was doing something that nobody else did, and conquering something that was unassailable for others. Until one night. Tears are streaming down my eyes just remembering this, and a chill running up my back. I'm going to try and explain what I saw and felt and heard. You can draw your own conclusions. It was a very normal early summer night. Cool with no breeze, clear skies with the stars and moon out, shining so brightly that after getting used to the dark, you could make out shapes and shadows fairly well. It was a perfect night for an adventure. I snuck out with my usual routine and quickly jogged out of the neighborhood and past the golf course. I had somewhere in mind where I wanted to go. There was a dry creek bed deeper into a small valley that I hadn't been before. Everything was going fine, and it was exhilarating to be going somewhere new and breaking a new trail. I didn't get very far into the woods that night though. Total silence was what made me stop. I remember it very clearly. Usually it was quite noisy, with the crickets and other insects. So loud, it would almost be annoying at times. But I encountered an area of complete dead silence, with only the sound of the breeze flowing through the pines. It was so odd that I just stood stock still, waiting, how I usually did, for some clue as to what was going to present itself. Instead, an awful sensation flooded my body, a sort of welling dread that made the fine hairs on my arm and legs stand. It was electric and torturous, sheer, utter terror. And then the scream happened. So close, I could have sworn it was coming from above me. The worst sound I've ever heard in my entire life. It wasn't a cougar. I know what those sound like. It was a long, pealing, horrendous wail full of mind-bending hate. It was at that moment I was sure I was about to die, that I had made a terrible mistake, and that now I was going to pay the price. Something was moving in the dark shadows of the sparse pine trees, right in front of me. Not moving like any animal, not a deer or even a bear, both of which I had encountered before. A lurching motion of 4 limbs with a shadow the size of a man. It was coming towards me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. Every nightmare a child has ever had about a monster chasing them when they couldn't run away was coming true. After that scream, everything was quiet. It wasn't making any noise as it moved towards me. No crackling of dry pine needles, no breathing, nothing. I couldn't move, and tears were streaming down my face. The terror I put away was coming back. I tried to run, and I remember fleeing faster than I ever had moved in my entire life. Total silence. Just the pounding of my feet and the scrambling of my hands in the pine needles and dirt roots. I fell. I remember planting my face in the dirt, knowing that I was about to die. I remember the silence coming over me, and a terrible chill. I remember the feeling of my bladder loosening, and the heat flooding down my legs. And I don't remember what came after that. When I came to, it was early morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, and my only thought was to somehow make it home before my dad woke up. And I flat out ran the many miles back home. My dog snarled at me, snapping at my heels as I jumped out back fence. It was so confusing, because we were the best of friends since I was the only one to play with them. I had larger worries though, because my dad was up, and I just managed to climb into my bedroom window and get changed. I went to school that day, but they sent me back with a fever. I never explored again after that night, and I was never the same. My dogs never acted the same around me either. I went from an almost too social active young man to a complete and total social recluse overnight. I barely spoke for very long. and I almost failed to graduate high school. It was like nothing could ever matter to me again. I don't know what happened, but I do know that something happened. About 7 years ago, I was on a backpacking trip with 3 friends, one a ranger, and the rest of us biology and botany nerds. And all 4 of us saw something that we cannot still explain. Day 1 went off without a hitch. It was a bit long, and there was a lot of elevation gain. But nonetheless, we set up camp and heated up some nice beans and rice under what can only be described as the clearest summer skies I can recall. This is up in Washington State, and the night sky from the mountains are just unreal. The second day was different. All 4 of us awoke shortly before dusk to a shrill scream. Not super uncommon. Most of us are pretty seasoned hikers and campers and backpackers. The sound of something getting killed is pretty universal. None of us could quite make it out. If I remember correctly, we mostly assumed it was a coyote. Anyway, it was pretty close, which is probably why it woke us all up. So we started scoping out a small radius around the campsite. We found what looked like somebody had put a bomb inside an animal. No evidence of an actual explosive, however. I'm just trying to give you the same picture I had in my head. A totally indecipherable heap of flesh and fur, probably about the size of a German shepherd, with similar fur coloration too. We discussed how odd it was for a bit, then decided more or less, what you gonna do, and moved on. Best explanation was something tore into it and bailed, maybe by the sound of us waking us up. On the 3rd day, we're winding down from a fairly short day of hiking. We were all tired, I suppose. I remember us joking about being old farts now and not being able to hustle like we would a few years prior. The sun was just making its way down over the tree line while we busted out the whiskey and started boiling a pot of water for more beans and rice. I'll never forget this. One of the crew was just launching into a story about his ex, and it went something like this. Yeah, so she was just about the worst possible kind of... And then he gets cut off by a loud pop, which we all unanimously recognized and described as a tree's last leg snapping before it falls. We're all standing now, scanning the tree line. We're in a small clearing, aside from the single large tree we're next to. A few minutes go by without a sound. Nothing. Then we start hearing the forest's life make noise again. We all settle back in, presuming the tree would lean up against another tree instead of hitting the forest floor. But it sounded pretty close, even though there weren't too many trees we needed to be concerned about. It couldn't reach us if it fell in the middle of the night. Then another wail, like the one we heard on the first night, except more distant. I never sensed it, but one of the crew said it sounded like it was coming from a cave, like it echoed. So we went looking for a cave in that general direction. We were out for about 45 minutes before one of us suggested we should head back, as we were going to be out of sunlight soon. Never did we find anything like a cave that could explain the reverberation. More importantly, it was starting to get dark, and we were a little a ways from the safety of our tents. Heading back towards the clearing and our campsite from the woods, something catches my friend's eye. "Did you see that?" He's pointing across the clearing about 9 o'clock. We're taking a direct path to our campsite, so it's dead ahead at 12. We're all looking in that direction, scanning the tree line. Where what? Dude, I'm telling you right there, was a person just beyond camp. He's visibly shaken by it. It's pretty obvious he wasn't fooling around or thought he could be mistaken. And if you're wondering, shaken, because we're no way near a road or town, and even the nearest trail is miles away. A handful of times I've run into other backpackers in similar ways, people checking out your camp, heading the direction of your fire. So the rest of us are pretty open, let's go check it out. But not our buddy. He suggested we all take a knee and wait and hide in the tree line's cover. So there we are, kneeling in the brush, staring at our own campsite from the other side of the clearing, when we all unanimously see a figure start to move against the brush from 9 to 8 to 7, counterclockwise. Remember, we're at effectively 6 o'clock, so this becomes increasingly unsettling. I remembered noticing our ranger buddy readying his rifle, and another friend putting a hand on his knife. I'm pretty sure we're all feeling the same uneasiness now. I say we saw a figure, but really, we could just hear and occasionally see the brush moving in the area. My ranger buddy declares it's just a bear. The original spotter, whispering his argument, is standing like a person. We decide that either way, getting into the clearing and making our presence known is the best choice. We either need to scare off this bear or confront this person. So we all stand up and jog into the clearing shouting, "Hey, bear!" This is more or less standard procedure in case you're wondering. All being sure to keep our eyes towards the area we last heard and saw something moving. Nothing happens. Nothing at all. We're all just standing in the middle of the clearing, somewhere about halfway between 6 o'clock position and our camp, just waiting for something to happen. We're about 20 minutes away from total darkness, when there's another wail from 4 o'clock. Remember, we're all staring towards 7 o'clock? I whirl around before realizing one of us was already looking that way, and his face is totally pale. There's a bunch of adrenaline here, and everything is happening pretty fast, and I'll never forget catching the look on his face before I fully turned around. Then I saw it too. We all did. There's a silhouette of a tall man leaning over something else, facing away from us, and then he clearly rests on one knee before turning to look our way. Our ranger buddy has his rifle in the air. "Hey, who the hell is..." He's about to lay his aim for hunting, when the figure comes to full stand. It's hard to gauge, probably about 6 foot, and then absolutely takes off away from us. I don't mean like a man scrambling to run away, or a bear bounding off into the bush. I mean like Usain Bolt, as if he were born and raised in the mountains. Never in my life have I ever seen anything like it, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit it. My first reaction was ghost. After a pretty long wait, and arguing about what we have to do, we swing back to the camp to grab a few flashlights and our lamp. It's now past dawn and getting pretty dark. We make our way over to where the figure was leaning, and another mound of flesh. Without getting too detailed, this time some unmistakable fox paws were intermixed. Again, it looked like it was exploded open, and the meat eaten on the spot, not harvested like a hunter. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear we didn't sleep much that night. We make jokes about encountering the Sasquatch out there. I've never been a spiritual man, and still am not. But it's very difficult to shake the inhuman, yet human supernatural nature of the way it looked and moved. Shadowy, and none of us could make out any kind of clothing that would break up its silhouette, since we could barely see any details anyway. We all figured an actual person's silhouette would be a bit more chopped by wearing a jacket, carrying something, a hat or whatever. And not to mention, I've never personally seen something kill quite like that. Closest thing I've seen is a deer carcass, post-bear, in a time of year that would have made it very hungry and aggressive, which wouldn't have been during our late summer hike. What gets me is we heard the same shrill wail 3 times, and the distance between our 2 sites and our day 3 site was close to 10 miles, meaning we were on the same general trail as it was, though none of us noticed any trail markings. Either that, or it was following us. This happened to me last year. I am a 21-year-old non-Native American from a 100% Germanic bloodline. I am acutely aware of skinwalkers and wendigos, mainly from the massive amount of time I spend on 4chan. I live in the hills of Ohio River Valley. I am an avid coyote hunter and fisherman. What time I'm not spending at work, playing video games or browsing 4chan, I'm in the woods or on the river. One night after I left work, I decided to go fishing at the pond on my friend's property to the northeast of my house. I got home, grabbed my rods, tackle box, and trusty HK-VP9, because I carry that everywhere I go nowadays, and ran to the store and bought some chicken livers for bait. I should also mention that I bought my puppy, a 9-month-old German Shepherd Rottweiler mix, who I called Mauser. As I arrived to my friend's property and began pulling my truck into the field surrounding the pond, the sun started to set. It was eerie quiet, no noises of nature, or any noise at all, other than that of my engine running. It made me feel kind of uneasy, but I just pushed it out my mind. I got out of the truck with my pup and began to set up my rods when Mauser started acting a little uneasy. I patted him gently on the side and tried to reassure him that everything was going to be fine. By the time my rods were set up and ready to go, it was dark out. So I went back to the truck to grab my glow sticks and headlamp. It was then that Mauser jumped into the truck and couldn't move. I asked what he was doing, almost expecting a reply, but instead, I was hit with the most god-awful stench I've ever had the misfortune of smelling in my life. A smell, a vile combination of sulfur and rotting flesh. I started to worry at that point. In an instant, every thread on 4chan that I read about skinwalkers flew through my mind. I stayed still and silent for a second, listening. All of a sudden, I see Mauser start shaking and hear footsteps behind me, the stench of rotting meat growing stronger. My heart was in my throat, and I had completely forgotten the handgun clipped underneath my steering wheel. I stood there for what seemed like hours, even though it was mere seconds. I slowly started to turn my head back towards whatever was behind me, and about 50 feet away, barely lit up by the backlight of the pond, was what I know to be a skinwalker. I was horrified. It was at least 9 feet tall, with the head of a deer and a human's torso, as well as deer legs. It looked to be rotting, Fight or flight had hit me at that point, so I jumped into my truck and slammed the door shut. I grabbed my pistol and rolled down the window and started shooting whilst trying to back out. I had my magazine empty in a mere second and was out of the field moments later. I had thought that I was safe and that I was going to get away. But oh, how wrong I was. I looked over and saw Mauser with all his hair standing up, teeth bared, savagely growling at something behind the truck. It was then that I felt the back of the truck drop, as if something had jumped on the bed, and I didn't dare look into my rearview mirror. I kept driving towards the dirt road to make it from the field back to my friend's house, and I heard a loud screech coming from right behind me. It sounded like it was close, but at the time far away, and coming from other directions. I drove for another 10 minutes, hearing tapping on my back windshield the entire time. Once I got back to my friend's driveway, all was silent. I gathered the courage to get out of the truck, forcing my pup to stay inside. I'd rather have something bad happen to me than him. This all happened last summer, almost a year ago. I go back there to shoot and do target practice sometimes, but I always have a feeling of dread around that pond, and I can still hear the screeching sometimes, as if I could forget that sound anyway. On the outskirts of Tallinn, Estonia, there used to be a military compound, which is now abandoned. In about 1998, me and a friend of mine went to explore the compound and various buildings in it. We found a building that went 3 levels underground and had a tunnel which we started to follow. At some point, we started to hear voices from the other side of the tunnel. We turned out the other way and made our way out of the building very quickly. In the same compound, we entered a bunker. It was quite dark since the bunker didn't have many openings for light to come in. As we stepped into one room, the floor seemed to be somewhat soft. Upon examining closer, it turns out that the entire floor was covered with sealed black plastic bags with something soft in it. As we were making our way across the floor, my leg went through one of the plastic bags. Turns out, the bags were used to cover corpses of dead animals. I saw maggots and rotten flesh, and it had a vile smell. We assumed that for some reason those dead animals in the bags were the animals that were put down in a somewhat closer animal shelter. I obtained a special wilderness permit to go to an area in the mountains of California where they hadn't allowed any foot traffic in 20 years. There were no trails. It was just myself and 2 other Marines, and we did it in exchange for seeing if there was any rare kind of trout in the streams up there. I guess the Forest Service didn't have anyone who wanted to do it. We hiked for 2 days with no trails, just using maps and a compass, and on the second day, we walked around this huge cliff to find a cabin with a lawn and solar panel and washer and dryer, the whole 9 yards, all built into the rock face of the cliff. You couldn't see it from above, so it had gone unnoticed for years. We talked to the guy that lived there, and he said that we were the first people he had seen hike in 14 years. He was a retired helicopter pilot, and had flown all of his equipment in by helicopter. He was squatting on federal land and he knew it. but he didn't seem worried. He said he likes to hike about every 2 weeks for supplies by a different route than we came in, and showed us. We used that route to get back to a trail that was beaten down so the walking was easier. All in all, it was pretty cool. The trout the Forest Service were looking for were in the creeks, so it is still closed to foot travel, and we never told the service about the old helicopter pilot. So I would guess he's still out there. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He led groups of tourists on horseback across the mountain trails and such, and he met a lot of people during his time there. He met this Native American guy who started out as a regular customer and eventually became an employee. He was from an Indian reservation, although he never said which. He also didn't explain why he left, but he was a cool guy, so my dad never really gave his origins much thought. He always figured that he left for personal reasons and didn't want to be bothered about it. So, my dad never brought it up again. One day, my dad and his brother and his Native American friend were out on the trail with a group of people. It was a pretty ordinary day. My dad and uncle told jokes back and forth, and their friend laughing and cheering, and the tourists took pictures with their bulky cameras. Nothing unusual. As they were moving along, someone shouted that they saw a coyote and pointed into a little valley on the left side of the field. Again, this is nothing strange. It was in the grassy chaparral of Central California. So coyotes are a very common sight. My dad and his companions stopped their horses so that their guests could have a look at the creature. My dad and his friend got chatting, but my uncle kept staring at the coyote, with his features all scrunched up, like he was trying to get a better look. My dad asked him what was up, and he said that the coyote didn't look healthy. It had very long, thin legs and walked abnormally. Most dogs walk by lifting a front leg and then lifting the opposite back leg. But this coyote walked by lifting both legs on one side of its body, sort of like a camel. Its snout was also a good 3 inches longer than normal, and it held its nose high in the air, as if it was sniffing for something. My dad said it was probably just deformed, and my uncle agreed. My friend, however, was silent. He was slightly shivering and staring directly at the weird coyote. My dad put his hand on his shoulder and asked what was wrong. With a shaking finger, his friend pointed at the coyote and said, "The tail. Look at the tail." My dad looked and said, "What do you mean it has no tail?" The friend said that he'd explained everything when they got back to base camp. So my dad led the guests down the trail, and the coyote followed them. It didn't come up from the valley, but it followed the group. The tourists thought it was fun to have a little companion, but my dad's friend never looked at it. He was silent the whole way back. When they were just a couple of 100 yards from the base camp, the coyote leaped out of the underbrush about 20 feet in front of my dad and his companions, freaking them the hell out, and the horses. The coyote stared directly at my dad's friend and smiled. Not a panting smile like most dogs do, but a full-on, teeth-bared smile, which showed off its yellow-brown stained teeth. The friend stared back and produced a small piece of wood with an arrow burnt into it. He showed its face to the coyote, which looked away. Then the creature howled. Coyote howls are usually high-pitched, but this one was very low-pitched, almost baritone. It sounded like the thing had liquid in its lungs, as if it were drowning, and able to make one final scream. Then it ran back into the bushes. My uncle and my dad, ever the jokesters, turned to the tourists and said, "Well, I hope you guys got your money's worth." At camp, my dad's friend wouldn't give them the whole story, only vague statements like, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." He said that he did this to protect my dad and uncle, because the less you know about it, the better. He gave them each a small piece of wood with an arrow on it, saying that it would protect them from the thing, and that he made it himself. He was glad he got to test one out. He drove out at 8 a.m, and my dad never saw him again. My father always used to tell this story to us when we were younger, especially during camping trips. He's a high-spirited kind of guy, so he always tells it in good spirits. But sometimes, he says that on cold nights when the wind is blowing and there's a rustle in the trees, he can hear the low howl of the thing that wasn't a coyote. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on the Great American Road Trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke, as my mom had been a long-haul trucker. I suggested that to save a ton of money, we should sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make curtains. By the end of our first week, we'd gotten so we could set up camp in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, and basically anywhere that seemed safe and semi-legal. There were never a night, after the first night anyway, where we felt scared, until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go on a set schedule and would never drive for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination really in mind, outside a few must-see landmarks. We'd drive to places we found the night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks we met at a campsite, in the back of their pickup, because I got hungry and overheard them saying they were going there too. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar, played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm, and got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them. We spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up into the campsite. There was one RV parked, and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello, and he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the entire time. Figuring he just wanted some privacy and thought we'd be obnoxious, we pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tez pointed out a campfire further down the campsite, and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks just by going up and offering beers or just chatting, so we wandered over. Near the campfire there were 2 men, the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly, and we sat down to chat with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out that the 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed harmless. This left us chatting with the younger man, who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting to him about our trip, families, everything. He then started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laugh, or for him to nudge Tez with his elbow, joke on the foreigner and the city girl, right? He never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed, as well as joked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes, the ranger had come back to it and was talking about something grabbing us from out of our car in the middle of the night. No matter how much we tried to steer the conversation away from serial killers, he kept latching back onto it. The older man was high as a kite at this point, and was staring at the stars, not talking. We'd just awkwardly laugh and sip our beers to try and get on the conversation, and see if it hopefully led elsewhere. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point it's pitch black, and I can't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside the circle. Suddenly there is a red dot in the darkness. and it took a moment for me to realize that it's a camera. The ranger is holding a camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't odd for people we met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous, dark hair, blue eyes, like a young Megan Fox, and we were friendly people, and liked having pictures taken with others. It was an entirely strange thing to have this person take a photo of us without asking or even indicating that that was going to be what he was going to do. We were both staring at him like deer in headlights at this point. But instead of realizing what he's doing is a bit weird, he checks his camera, adjusts some things and takes another photo, this time with the flash. No asking for us to smile, no posing a group photo, and no explanation. After the photo, he comes back to the fire and sits down, and not a word is said about it. At this point, me and Tez are mutually freaked out. We make some bullshit excuse that we need to go set up our campsite and nope the hell out of there. When we stand to leave, the UFO guy smiles and says to have a good night. However, the ranger looks at us with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes and says, "Be careful out there. There are more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. I wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jumped in the front seats. My friend Tez is all but hyperventilating. "Why did he take a picture of us?" I was shaking. I responded. I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims. She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both freaked out. She was in a full panic and turns the headlights on in the car. I immediately yell at her to turn them off, because now he knows exactly where our car is. God knows why, but that is the only night we did not set up camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, so we just put the car in drive and floored it out of the campsite. As we got onto the dirt road, the ranger was walking towards our car with some cold expression. As you can obviously tell by the fact this story is being told, we found another place to crash for the night, and fortunately, weren't his next victims. I don't know if he is a serial killer or not, but regardless, he certainly knows how to creep a pair of girls out. I am an avid outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I'm very familiar and used to wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe to be a cryptid, a skinwalker. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear. A bear cannot move how it did. And it was not a normal wolf, as they cannot comfortably run on two legs. Whereas what charged us seemed natural doing so. This happened in July of 2007. I was 17 years old at the time, and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin. or at least by the bonfire by the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was that if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach. And at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is, of course, until this incident. So, this happened somewhere between midday and 2. My cousin and I were having an airsoft battle, and I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point, and were standing at the edge of the clearing, on the trail, talking, and he was about 10 feet away from me, when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right. And that is when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf-like creature as large as a black bear. It wasn't normal. It was on 2 legs, crouching next to the tree, with its arm grasping the tree with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we had to go. The next thing I knew, he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie, who was locked on, who sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and ran when it looked like it was dropping to all 4s. It charged us and sounded right on our asses, barreling through the brush, but for whatever reason, let us go when we left the tree line and headed for the cabin. What struck me was the sheer size. This creature appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now, I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I've heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs. Nor do they get as big as black bears. The closest description is a skinwalker, and I'm convinced that is what we saw. This happened a few months ago. I am a female, and at the time, I was 18. Now, I live with my mother, stepfather, and younger brother in a 3-bedroom apartment on the bottom floor. It is a nice place with 2 balconies, which are about 8 feet off the ground, because the building is built on a rather steep hill in an isolated area. Now, the front door of the apartment is self-closing, and when it closes by itself, it slams rather loudly. Now, my family had decided to leave and go for some Indian tacos, and since I was home, they didn't bother to lock the door. I decided to stay home because I am an introverted extrovert and had already been social enough that day, and I wanted some me time. My family is located in a town in Nebraska that doesn't really have much crime. It is nothing like the part of the town that we originated from. It is a town full of military families that have plenty of money. Pretty much the only thing to worry about are the little city brats who have been spoilt so much they think they can get away with anything. Anyway, the apartment setup is quite simple. You have the front door with a little hallway, which, if you go right, you then have the living room, kitchen and dining room. Then if you go left, there is another hallway which has 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. Now my room is the very first one in the hall. One cannot pass my room without me knowing. This was an intentional choice when we moved here, due to my anxiety and PTSD. I have problems with paranoia because of past experiences. My little brother was intentionally put between my bedroom and my parents at the end of the hall because of said paranoia. Mainly, my need to check on my family members after I've had one of my terrible nightmares. Now, I had laid back on my futon in my room, and I had my bedroom door closed so that I could enjoy my privacy without my anxiety kicking in and making me think someone in the apartment was with me. I was listening to true horror stories through my headphones and reading Naruto fanfiction on my phone when I heard the front door open and close. I glanced at the clock and it read 7:36 p.m. I thought, okay, they're back, and my little brother will follow the same routine and burst into my room without knocking to bug me and let me know that they were home. I waited. Nothing. No yell from my mum that they were home. No jingling of keys. No door opening. Nothing. I took off my headphones and listened. I could hear someone walking on the carpet. The familiar swish noise of footsteps travelled around the whole apartment. I waited, my anxiety rising up in my throat before the calm came. Now the problem that I have with my anxiety and other issues is that everything happens as a delayed reaction. During a crisis, I am able to act completely calm and in control. But after I am in a safe place, I break down completely. I sat on my futon opening my mouth slightly to quiet my breathing. Smooth, slow breaths through my nose and mouth at the same time. My heart was still pounding. I looked at the door to my room, waiting, thinking that it must just be me hearing things again. Thin apartment walls and such. I then heard the person walk down the hall and try to open my parents' bedroom. I stared at my door even harder. I heard them turn and walk back down the hall, stopping halfway. Shit. They must have seen the light under my door, I thought. I watched the door, not wanting to move from my futon and have the metal futon stand make a loud creaking noise. They came to my door, and I heard them touch it. The instant I saw the door move slightly, from them putting weight on it, I jumped up and ran to the door. Now the entryway to my room has the door inside a little square area, so I ran over and put my back against the wall and put both feet on the door. I grabbed a nearby blanket and put it at the bottom of the door. I watched the door handle, and it never moved. They never even touched it. The person on the other side just kept pushing on my closed door and latched door. No lock, just me holding it closed. I felt the door push against the weight of my legs and feet. I knew I wasn't imagining this shit. I could actually feel the door move. I still had my phone in my hand. I quickly turned to call the volume all the way up and dialed 911. A man answered and I gave him my address. The volume so loud you could hear the conversation, as if the phone was on speaker, and I explained the situation to the dispatcher, and we talked for a bit. He asked me if I had something to defend myself, and I told him I had pepper spray in my purse, but that it was 8 feet away from my bedroom door, and laughingly said that it's probably not a good idea right now. The dispatcher agreed with me. Now, during all of this, the person on the other side of my door had been listening, and it seemed as if they finally understood that I had called 911, because I heard them run through my apartment, over to one of the balcony doors, rip it open and run out. I informed the operator of this, and we continued talking until the cops arrived and they checked. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved as far as I could tell. My family arrived to the cops being there and were freaking out. My mother nearly went mama bear, she was so freaked. So that's the story. Why you should always lock your doors, even if you're at home. I just moved from North Carolina to Durango, Colorado. I'm a Sasquatcher at heart, and I immediately started looking up area reports. In so doing, I found some nearby in San Juan and decided to drive out. Nothing strange. During my week work, I researched reports for the entire four corners and inevitably stumbled back on Skinwalkers. The next place I decided to scout took me to the edge of the Navajo reservation, though I didn't intend on entering. I just misjudged my distance in hiking. It was nice out. Once I did figure out where I was, I turned around immediately, since I was unsure of the permit requirements on the reservation. Hiking out, the dog stopped and tried pulling sideways. I let her roll over the grass, and she pulled out a bone. It was a skinny and small bone that didn't appear to be human. I didn't think much of it, and let her keep it. And honestly, I think this is where we messed up. 3 mornings later, I'm in bed and get awakened by rustling. I thought it was the dog, but she wasn't in the room. It was coming from outside my cracked window. I got up and crept over, expecting to be greeted by a raccoon or a possum. Under my window though, close enough to reach out and touch, was a mule deer with an impressive rack. I went to grab my camera, and when I do, it was gone. I never heard it move away though, which is odd, but I thought nothing of it. The next morning at the same time, this time, I decided to be ready to catch a picture for my dad, since we hunt. I prepared my camera and eased the curtain open just a touch. He was in the yard about 7 yards away and facing away from the house at a slant. Absolutely magnificent. I had no sooner seen him than he turned to face me, head first. But then his hind end appeared to teleport around. He legitimately never moved his legs. It's like he was just in one position and then immediately in another. I slammed my window shut thoroughly freaked the hell out. Then, in the hallway, I stopped myself and turned around. It was gone when I got back. I couldn't pinpoint what had scared me so badly. Even with Sasquatch, I'm skeptical of every twig crack, whoop, or knock. I attributed the odd movement to it being so early and assumed the street light flickered or something. I wrote off my fear as having observed a charging-like posture. Since that morning, I've been feeling very disconnected from my dog. I keep having strange daytime nightmare scenarios of her just attacking me out of nowhere. I didn't even want her sleeping in the same room as me. This is saying something, because I love my dog unconditionally, and I know that she'd never do anything to me. But I can't shake the paranoia whenever she's around. The final straw got to me is the dream I had recently. I dreamt I shot her while she was sleeping out of the yard. Then I took her skin. I raced out to the spot where she found that bone, and there was an old man waiting. I asked if I can transform now, and he said no, but that he could. Then he took the skin from me and flung it around himself, immediately becoming a larger and more distinctly evil form of my beloved dog. Then he ripped me to shreds, and I woke up. I immediately got up to find that she was in my room asleep. Then I went looking for that bloody bone, and I couldn't find it anywhere. She's hidden it in the yard. I genuinely believe I'm in some trouble here, and I don't want to know what comes after this. I had a business trip that took me to Arizona, and didn't want to pass up a chance to visit some great views and hiking in Sedona. So worked it into a long weekend. I got up early one morning to hit the trail before the pink jeeps descended upon some of the more visited places. First stop was a previous Anasazi site, purely for historical reasons. After hiking in from the road by foot, I got a good 30 minutes at the site before the first jeep tour showed up, packed up my day, and headed down the trail. My second goal that morning was a fairly gradual but scenic hike up the side of a nearby mesa. However, the weather that day wasn't cooperating, and I kept my eye on some thunderstorms to the south that were building. As I continued to gain altitude on the switchback trail, I had a beautiful view over the valley towards Cathedral Rock. The low clouds filled in and began to build, and some downpours were visible, but no strikes landing on the mesas in the rain and lightning. I picked up my pace and made the lip of the mesa, walking slowly to a smooth rocky outcropping with great views and to catch my breath. I wasn't sure what caused me to it, but I took off my hat, turned around and looked up. I saw low scud clouds with wispy tendrils slowly swirling in a circle overhead. The outer fringe was dark grey, the central core a lighter shade, and suddenly before my eyes I saw a large wingspan bird appear from the center of the swirl all dark, not the coloration of an eagle, and with the wing feathers separated like a turkey or vulture, but even larger. I watched the bird as it drifted, sometimes with, mostly again, the direction of rotation of the cloud swirl, and I don't recall seeing it flap. I took a quick moment to look south at the advancing storm and saw my first lightning strike well off in the distance. I looked up at the bird again. It made a right-hand turn for the center of the swirl and then vanished as it cruised across the center of the swirl once more. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, processing what I'd seen, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing. Truly a mesmerizing natural encounter. I grabbed my pack and made tracks down the trail to make it to the vehicle before the storm that was approaching fast. Being alone on the trip, I really had no one to discuss it with, and mulled over the experience for the rest of the afternoon. I took a warm shower, dressed up, and then drove to an Italian restaurant, newly opened on the main drag in town. They didn't seat until 5 p.m, so I wandered into the German mineral shop next door to find some mementos to give to my friends when I got back home. The lady behind the counter wasn't friendly, not overly chatty, and looked the granola part that I would expect for such a place. Incense burned in the corner, and peaceful Native American flute music played over the speakers. She asked how my stay was in Sedona, and told her I was enjoying the views and the hiking. I told her where I'd gone hiking to see the Anasazi cliff dwelling, and she walked to an old yellowed map on the wall and pointed to the site. "This one?" she asked, interested. I looked at her and said yes. She was pointing to the site I had visited. I looked next to where she pointed, about where the mesa was, and a very large red swirl was centered there. The map had several of those markings, mostly around the perimeter of the valley. I asked her what they marked, and she replied, "Oh, those show where the energy centers are that the Native Americans discovered before the white men came to the valley." I hadn't told her about my trip up the mesa, but she must have sensed it from my facial expression and asked, "Did you see something up there you can't explain?" I had to admit yes, and without inquiring she said, "Yeah, it's a pretty active place. I like to go up to the mesa and get rejuvenated there, particularly when the weather is acting up." For a cynic like me, that was a pretty unsettling and simultaneously awesome day. There's a story where I'm from about this Comanche chief who cursed the first settlers to settle in the Llano Estacado. The winter after this happened, one of the settlers started hearing this strange whistle in the wind when he went out to chop wood. A high, low, high, like a bird call. He listened for a while, and the whistling kept getting louder and louder, as though something was making its way towards him. As the whistling got louder, he could hear indistinct words carried on the whistle. The dude did the smart thing and ran inside to his fire and grabbed his gun and waited by the door the rest of the night. The next day, the guy goes into town and tells a couple of his buddies about the whistling, thinking it might be some kind of wild animal. His buddies tell him that they haven't heard of any animals that whistle like that, and proceed to tease him about his wild imagination. The settlers laugh it off and felt foolish. About a week later, the owner of the general store noticed that the first settler hadn't come back in on his weekly supply runs, so the first settler's friends head over to check up on him. They found his family butchered and eaten, and the settler was nowhere to be found. They saw all the settler's clothing and boots were thrown about outside. The town brings a posse together to hunt down the murderer, but no tracks are found for a mile around the stead, and it was getting dark, so they bury what's left of the bodies and head back to town. Along the way, a couple of them start to hear this strange whistling noise on the wind, a high-low-high. The posse is unnerved, but continues towards town. The whistling grew louder and louder even through the wind. The next day, another settler goes missing, the family butchered and his clothes scattered in front of the house. The next day, another house. All the while, the same damn whistle carried by the wind. High, low, high. The words carried by it can only be heard by the men who butchered their families and ran out into the snowy plains of North Texas. I went backpacking with my cousin about 4 miles into the Angeles National Forest. We set up camping during the day and went on with our normal backpacking routines. Come nightfall, we each go into our individual tents and call it a night. Around 3 a.m, I start hearing light scratching on my tent, as if rats were trying to get in. I smacked the side of the tent a few times to scare them away, but nothing. It just intensified. I couldn't pinpoint from which part of the tent the scratching was coming from, so I kept smacking. Nothing. At this point, I look over at my dog, and he's looking at me like, I ain't going out there. So I try to ignore it and go back to sleep, but I can't. It's freaking me out, and I don't want to leave my tent to investigate. So after a while, my cousin calls out to me, "Hey man, have you been hearing shit outside? Because I've been hearing footsteps around my tent." So now we're debating going out to check it out or not. We don't. Eventually the sounds went away, but we didn't fall asleep for the rest of the night. In the morning we checked our campsite, and there was nothing. No traces of anything. No tracks, no scratches on my tent, poop, nada. We promptly packed up and got the hell out of there. I went camping in Big Sur, California, with one of my best friends. It was off-season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk from the ocean. It was in a huge open field, surrounded by a lush forest. In the background were limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. Very epic. We spent the night around a campfire, telling stories and eating. We're both pretty experienced backpackers. We are very diligent in ensuring we do not leave any traces of food by our site, and almost everything other than our essentials go into the bear box. I have my dog with me too. She's leashed around one of the few trees in the field on a long metal leash and full harness. It's a full moon out, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. it was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. At around 1 p.m, something spooks my dog. Now, she's used to the woods and has an incredibly calm demeanor. But I mean, she is flipping out, tugging hard on the leash, as if she's desperate to escape. And she does. She pulls so hard that her harness snaps and she goes bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lose my cool. I drop everything and bolt after her. I am not thinking straight running into the woods at night. My only concern was getting her, even if it meant risking my own safety. I rescue her, and I find her curled in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line, otherwise I would have been totally lost. I walk back carrying her, and my heart is pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. The thought is now unbearable. I can feel her heart pounding too in my arms. She is legitimately terrified. I am no longer in a great mood. We all head to bed in my tent, but my dog won't lay down. She refuses. Her ears are up, and she's staring intensely at the tent wall, as if she could see through it and is tracking something. It takes a while for my nerves to calm down from after the chase. I'm working hard at taking deep breaths. I'm reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. That my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon. Maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. And that is when I hear it. The cackling. A high-pitched laughter that is full of disgusting types of joy coming from outside my tent. My senses go on high alert. My body tenses up so tightly. It's like I'm about to break in half, and I cannot even breathe. And then I hear more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away. It fills my hearing, laughing and more laughing. It's loud and just sounds so wrong. I can't even bring myself to move to look at my friend. It's like my entire body has given up. The laughs are then followed up with blood-curdling screams. It honestly sounded like someone was being murdered. It was full of panic and horror and sadness. Dear God. It could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. Finally, my friend says, "What the hell?" I even begin to laugh a little, because the situation was so intense and wild. I had no idea how else to react. I couldn't handle this. I suggest that we bolt for the car. It's a mile away, so we decide to wait it out. We just listen to the laughter and screaming until it fades away, and even when it's over, I don't bother going out of bed. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. We were driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, and I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap on my window. My uncle sped up, and I was loudly praying in my native language. I don't know what was going on, and thought it was over, until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle started saying, "Look at me, don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap. But from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed, and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil forces will forget our faces." I remember curling up on my seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer until we reached my grandmother's house. I will tell you the story my Uncle Joe told me at Christmas a few years ago. He had arrived in a leg cast, and we all wondered why. Well, he worked for the Water Resources of the United States, U.S. Geological Survey, outside of Billings, Montana. Uncle Joe is a tall, lean, athletic man that ran 5 miles a day during the week before going to work. He is an avid outdoorsman. One day, he was out in the mountains leaning over a creek to collect a water sample when he heard a loud huffing noise behind him. He turned and saw a grizzly bear running towards him. Joe knew better, but instinct took over and he jumped into an adrenaline-fueled sprint. He got 2 steps before the bear swatted his leg and hamstrung him. He collapsed to the ground and pretended to be dead. The bear stopped, sniffed a couple of times, then turned and ambled away. Joe didn't know why the bear had approached him, but his running away told the bear he was prey. Fortunately, the bear wasn't hungry that day. I am an 18-year-old male, and I didn't think I scared easily until this happened. At the time of this event, it was summer here in Texas. I picked up my girlfriend, and we went to meet my cousin and his girl for a double date at the local river. Now, with it being very hot in summer, we went swimming for several hours, and as it got dark, we began the half-mile walk back to our vehicles. My girl, Taylor, was visibly shaken as we walked back, whispering to me, "Did you hear that? It sounded like something was following us." My bravery was boosted by being in a group, and I shouted, "Hey man, piss off!" Now my cousin Jay and I are big dudes. We're both over 6 foot, and we're around 220 pounds without much fat. In an instant response to what I said, the sound of the footsteps came to a close, and this horrific-looking creature emerged from the tree line. The only way to accurately describe it would be a bipedal, very large dog with a human face. This thing had to be easily over 8 feet, and it was staring at me dead in the eyes. I think at that moment, I almost shat myself, and we bolted and reached our vehicles and took off. As we were speeding down the dirt road that leads to the entrance of the park, I heard a god-awful roar that no animal or human could produce. Luckily, we made it home safely. We researched, and we believe that we encountered a Skinwalker. And you can bet I am never going to that river again. I was performing research on various tree bacteria in the woods when a shirtless, heavy-set man comes out of nowhere with a seriously dangerous-looking axe. he's sweating and smiling, as though he has just got done chopping. Mind you, we're in the middle of nowhere between two bordering states. It's uncommon to see anyone other than patrol. Like a bumbling idiot, I announce my feelings and inquire about his axe. His response? Yeah, it's pretty sharp. No problem cutting through somebody if you're not careful. Immediately I noped out of there, walking at the brisk pace I could without running. Tried patting on my radio every now and then, hoping he'd think it was working. And it wasn't. I looked behind me every so often, and he just stood there the entire time. Some say he's still there to this very day. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return from the time in a camping trip. A good friend I know in the area very well was one of the search and rescues who was called in to assist in the search. Him and I head out in the general direction of the teens. We'd been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers in the woods at this point when we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck in the ground, with carvings in trees, and a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose in the tree. This place was near no roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would often go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Someone had been there within a couple of hours of us and had made these things. Mind you, we were still looking for the teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settle down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more and more ground before it gets hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I notice a bit of a shirt that is caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and they're calling everybody back. All the weird things we'd seen that day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I am a 21-year-old male, and here is a story that happened about 10 years ago. My name is Matthew Smith. My grandmother on my mother's side has always been very superstitious, for lack of a better word. She is not religious, but she does believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she'd never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visit was pretty uneventful. Typical boring old people stuff. Except, she always kept her curtains drawn shut, and would always peek out the window, and when someone asked her what she was doing, she would simply reply, "Yenaldushi is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit, until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandma and my then baby brother, who's now 19, were in the front yard that evening planting flowers, when all of a sudden, my grandmother starts shouting at my brother to get away from the creature and that it's not safe. Of course, being in Nevada, we assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, so we run outside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house, standing out in the yard was a large, black, Great Dane-sized dog thing. It was staring at my grandmother with an intensity I'd never seen before. It looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she kept repeating, "The Yenaldoshi has found me," and she moved a few weeks later. A buddy and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail, only the North Carolina to South Carolina portion. It was summer, the weather was great, and we cross into South Carolina and meet a super nice elderly couple and talk with them and ate lunch. We made camp about half a mile from them after we part ways. So, we are about to fall asleep in our tent when we hear some rustling in the bush around the campsite. That's fairly common there, as there are a shit ton of squirrels and other animals around. The rustling didn't sound like a squirrel after a while, and it was actually multiple sounds coming from multiple places around us. My first thought, being a southerner who hunts, was that it was a pack of skidding coyotes. I was so wrong. We started hearing what sounded like low-level incantations, so after a few minutes, I'm fairly relieved that I don't have to fight coyotes. But then I remember that Carolina mountain folk can be some weird people. The chanting gets closer, and we can audibly hear what appears to be about 10 men clearly and repeatedly chanting, "Lord help us, Lord save us." It was similar to low-level and slow rhythmic monk chants. Well, that's creepy as shit, so I decide to let anyone near our tent know that we are armed inside. I take out the magazine because I don't want to inject a round, and pull the slide back and let go to clearly make the sound of a gun being racked. Obviously, I put the magazine in and the chamber around after. That sound must have done the trick, because they walked past us. They were literally walking through our campsite to get to some type of gathering. We didn't sleep that night at all. It was the last night of our trip for us, so we kind of brushed it off to crazy, weird capping off of the trip. 2 days later, we were hanging out with some friends, and on a TV in the background happened to be the local news. There was a story running about an elderly hiking couple found murdered on the Appalachian Trail about 2 miles from where we were camping. They showed their pictures, and sure enough it was the couple we met. They had been murdered and dismembered, and their body parts were found organized around a ritual site, like they were placed specifically according to some crazy demonic seance. We literally could have been swooped up by those men, and that could have happened to us. And all that time, I think about that poor couple and what happened to them. Carolina mountain people are really odd breeds sometimes. My boyfriend, now husband, decided to go on a road trip to my dad's hunting cabin in northern West Virginia, just a few counties over from Point Pleasant. We packed all our gear into our truck the night before, so that we could get an early start the next morning. We rise and shine extra early because we couldn't contain our excitement. Our trip to the cabin goes fine. We reach the town that the cabin is near and load up on groceries. About an hour later, We are turning down the dirt road towards the cabin. Now the cabin is about 50 miles back in the boondocks, away from any kind of civilization. It's a very isolated and creepy place at times. We drive down the dirt road for what seems like forever. Then we finally start to see the cabin. Both of us are tired from the trip and plan on relaxing by the fireplace and watching some DVDs as soon as the bags and groceries are unpacked. We get everything inside, and I start dinner while my boyfriend, Neil, plans on gathering some firewood out back. By 7, the sun is setting, and we make sure all the doors and windows are locked. It's a small one-bedroom cabin, so there was maybe 5 windows and 2 doors. After we clean up, we decide to watch Catch Me If You Can on DVD, so nothing scary. I reach for a cigarette, only to find that my pack is empty. I ask Neil where the carton was, and he just tells me that it was in the truck, and asks if he wants me to fetch them. I tell him no, that I will, and slip on my shoes and make my way to the door. Now, I have always been scared of the dark, and hate going outside for as long as I can remember when it's pitch black. I turn back to Neil and ask if he will stand at the front door while I go to the truck. He says he will, and makes his way over, and I ease myself outside and step down to the truck. I was reaching in to get the carton when I hear this sound. At first, it sounded like a woman screaming. Then it changed to howling. Then it was like one of those sounds came together to form this one creepy sound. It's quite difficult to explain. It sounded like a demon and a werewolf all in one. I made a beeline for the cabin, and I see Neil's face fully drained of color. I push him inside and ask him what the hell that was. It took him a while to answer me, and he said that he didn't know. I have been in the woods hunting and fishing with my dad and brothers all my life, and I have never heard any animal sounds like that before. I told him. Then we hear it again, only it's near the living room window, and Neil makes a mad dash to the bedroom to get his pistol, and I get my dad's hunting rifle from the closet. I had never been so scared in all my life. I thought, what if this thing was trying to come in? Then we hear it again at the front door. I take aim at the door. My tiny hands were shaking, thinking, oh my God, please help us. I may be a 5'4" female, but I was going to unleash hell on this thing if it tried to step foot inside. Then it screamed again, only it wasn't at the door anymore. It was at the kitchen window. Neil and I stood back with our guns at the ready. Then we heard a crunching sound like metal being destroyed. We were scared to move. And finally, after about an hour of standing back to back like that and not hearing anything else, we eased over to the kitchen window to see if we could spot anything. Neil, being taller than I, looked first and said, oh my God. it ripped a hole in my truck. I looked out the window to see a huge hole ripped in the door. We then double-checked every window and door to make sure they were locked, and we stayed up all night, terrified that the thing would come back. Morning came, and we decided to inspect the truck. Neil went out first, with his pistol by his stand, and I had my hunting rifle. We get to the truck, and there were claw marks from the tail light to the passenger door, then a huge hole, like this thing had punched it. We go back inside and call the forest ranger. He comes out about 3 hours later, looks at our truck, and then tells us that in the last 6 months, 12 people have gone missing from this area, and the farms that are close have reported the same sounds that we have during the night. And in the next morning, they find their farm animals are either gone or gutted. He told us it would be wiser to clear out until they could find the animal responsible for all of this. He looked scared and pale himself. He said he didn't want to be up here for a long period of time, but he would wait for us to pack our things and follow us down the main road. We didn't want to be told twice, so we tossed our stuff in the truck and flew down that dirt road. When we made it to the main road, we thanked him and went on our way. To my knowledge, they have never found any animal, thing, person, nothing that was doing those kind of things in the woods, and we have never been back there. We didn't see what it was, and I'm glad we didn't, because I do know that no animal making those sounds could ever do that kind of damage to a truck. Not even a bear. This following experience happened a few years after that. So my dad lets one of his bestest buddies that lives in town grow Christmas trees on his property because it's farmland, and my dad doesn't farm the land. He just uses the cabin as a getaway for hunting. When his buddy goes and harvests the trees, my dad goes up to help him out, and in return, gets however many trees he wants. My stepmom usually is always by his side, but she had come down with a brutal type of flu and couldn't go. My dad asked if my husband and I would go on this trip and help him out. But due to the events that we experienced last time, I refused at first. I then got thinking and began feeling quite guilty. You see, my dad isn't in the best of health anymore. When my 19-year-old brother passed away, it completely destroyed him, and he had a light heart attack. And since then, his heart isn't the best. Well, I talked it over with my husband, and he said that it was my call. I called my mum to see if she could keep our kids for the weekend, and she obliged. So I called my father and told him that we were going to help him. That night, I took the kids to my mum's, packed and loaded our gear with my own pistol and my trusty .22 rifle. I have other guns, but my .22 is light and never failed me yet. My husband also packed his pistol and rifle. We were going to prepare this time, just in case anything happened. The next morning, we met Dad and set out on our journey up north. After 5 hours of driving, we finally come to the dirt road turn off, and I admit at that point my stomach sank and I started to sweat. I could tell that my husband was feeling scared too. We get to the cabin, unpack our things, and we change into the warmer clothes and put coveralls over them. I load my pistol and place it inside its holster, in my side, and load my rifle and sling it over my shoulder. This is the normal thing to do at the cabin when you're going into the woods, because of all the wild animals. I could handle any animal. It was the thing that I was worried about. We go outside and set out on the ATVs. The Christmas trees were on the other side of the property. When we get there, we notice that my dad's buddy isn't there yet, and I ask if he calls him before we left the cabin, to which he hangs his head and says no. I tell my dad to go back and call him, and that we will stay put in case he shows up. He agrees and sets out back towards the cabin, and we are left alone in the middle of this Christmas tree forest. I get off the ATV to stretch my legs, and Neil needed to take a leak. So he goes a little ways away to do that, and I'm standing there and notice everything is quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Not even the wind blowing. I get this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it feels like I'm being watched. My heart was in my throat, and I was getting so nervous, I was starting to shake. I yell for Neil, and nothing. I walked a little in the direction he went, and yelled for him again. Still nothing. At this point, I knew something wasn't right. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement along the trees. I stopped and stood as still as I could. The quiet was deafening. I heard the trees behind me move, and I turned around and saw a tall, shadowy figure moving beyond the pine trees. I was beyond scared and screamed. I ran for the ATV, got on it, and geared down to start it, and reached for the key, but there was only air. I looked down to find no key in the starter, and my stomach sank. Neil must have taken it with him. I knew how to hotwire it, but my hands were shaking so badly, and the time it would take me to do that meant that it would already be onto me. My heart was beating like a wild drum, and I took a deep breath, knowing I had two choices. One, I could go into the woods and look for Neil, and risk coming into contact with whatever the shadow was. Or I could set off back towards the cabin to get my dad. My mind was racing, and my choice was made. I was going to walk back to the cabin to get my dad and return for Neil. I hopped off the ATV and stepped on towards the way back to the cabin, and then I heard it. A faint cry of "help me" was coming from the forest. Tears started streaming down my face, and I turned and ran towards Neil's voice. I screamed at Neil again to keep yelling so that I could find him. I was running, and branches were slapping me in the face and over my body. But I didn't dare slow down. I could hear that I was getting closer, because his voice was growing louder. I kept running towards it, and then I found him. He was sitting against a tree, with blood streaming down his face. I ran to him and inquired what happened, and Neil said something big hit him, and that was all he could remember before he blacked out. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew that we couldn't stay in these woods. I told Neil that I was going to help him, and that we were going to get the hell out of here. Finally, after a few minutes of pulling and lifting, I got him to his feet. We started walking slowly back through the woods to the ATV. Then we heard it. Something running through the trees. We looked at each other and tried to move faster. We kept going still, hearing the thing running right beside us. We made it to the forest clearing, and we could see the ATV. Neil said to lean him against one of the trees and to go get the ATV. I did as he said. When he was safely against the tree, I turned to go towards the ATV and ran into a wall. I looked up and saw a huge thing standing at least 7 foot tall with hair everywhere. It looked down at me with its hell-colored red embers. I was so terrified that I couldn't move at all. All I could do was stare. Neil screamed at me, and I awoke from my shock, and my mind went blank. I moved around the creature and made a dash towards the ATV. I was almost there. Then something grabbed my shoulder. I looked and saw this huge claw, and I was thrown backwards into a huge pine tree. Before I passed out, I heard a shot ring out, and then another, and then nothing but total darkness. I woke some time later and found myself laying on the bed at the cabin. I tried to move, but everything hurt, and my dad came into the room. He told me not to move, otherwise I'd hurt myself more. I looked at Dad and asked what happened. He said I was running towards the ATV, and his friend saw the creature right behind me. And as it threw me backwards, he and his friend unloaded their shotguns into it. He was silent after that, and I asked him what happened after that. Dad's eyes looked at me with color gone from his face and told me that the damned thing fled after letting out a god-awful scream. We don't know what that creature was, but I have the feeling that the creature is the very same from that first night at the cabin those years ago. Since then, my dad has forbidden anyone from going there. Even his buddy with the pine trees said he would not be returning. As for Neil, he recovered and is doing well. As for me, I can't say the same. When it grabbed my shoulder, it sunk its claws into me. The claw marks are slowly healing, but I have been noticing some changes. Like last night, I found 2 knots on my shoulder blades where I am growing hair at an alarming rate. I honestly do not know what's going on with me or what will happen, but I can tell you, this is the most terrified I have ever been in my entire life. You see, some interesting things working nights as a janitor, such as a life-size doll under the bank president's desk. You learn some hilarious quirks, like an official wanting the vacuum marks perfectly parallel on his carpet, because he gets upset otherwise. Sometimes you see things you can't quite explain, like the reflection of a dog in a mirror that is never there when you turn around, but shows up night after night. Some things are quite chilling, like when the building music would switch on by itself as I turned the lights out. Of course, being in empty buildings alone at night made everything take on an extra dimension of spookiness. One of the only things that truly scared me, however, because it was more tangible than the mirror dog ever could be, and potentially more dangerous than glitchy Muzak. It was a miserable night, with blizzard conditions that are not uncommon in winter here. The wind was howling, snow was blowing, and it was dangerously cold. Altogether, the kind of night you don't want to be out in. My last building for the night was in the outskirts of town, in the real middle of nowhere. There were no nearby houses, and nothing in that area was open at night. In short, there was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially in that weather. The building was not a spooky one, just isolated. I made an absolute habit of always locking the doors of the building that I was working in, because even in a safe town, a female janitor alone at night seems like too easy a target. That night was no different. I know I locked that door, and if I hadn't closed it firmly, the strong wind would have. I went about my usual routine, turning all the lights on all 3 floors, and then setting up my supplies. The building had an odd layout, with a sort of bird's nest loft that the boss's office was in, overlooking the main floor. I usually started with a loft and headed up there, but realized I had forgotten something and headed back down. I was distracted, and this building always annoyed me, but I wasn't listening to music and didn't even have earbuds in, so I was very reasonably alert. So I was a little surprised to find the side door standing wide open, with the wind rushing in and snow already drifting up. I froze a bit, because there was no reason that door should be open. I checked the parking lot quickly, in case the building owner had for some reason showed up in the middle of the night. No cars but mine. After locking the door, I shut the building. I started searching the building, starting with the basement. I didn't see anyone, and nothing was disturbed. As my search reached the loft level, the reflection of the basement lights in the stairwell went out. Then the lights on the main floor went out, and I heard the door bang open and rattle in the wind. So I shut myself in the office for a while. Eventually, I admitted that I had to finish the building, or I would probably get fired. So I locked that door for the 3rd time that night, turned all the lights back on, and cleaned faster than I ever had before. I should have called the police, but luckily, nothing happened that night, or on any other nights since. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I want to talk to you today about why there was no video yesterday and why you got a compilation tonight. So, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but during the production of the audiobook, I did encounter a few snags. I tried breaking it down over time and recording it at home, which didn't turn out to be the best because when I played it back, it didn't sound to the quality I wanted it to. And not only that, the company with which I work with to produce the audiobook has certain requirements. One of those being basically the level of silence in the background. So when I'm not speaking, it's that level of silence that needs to be at a really low level, almost inaudible. And where I live, there are loud noises. I live next to a busy road, so I couldn't always get that quality, which would have made it very difficult for me to keep it up. So I had to work. I had to make about 8 days worth of videos the week before, and then, you know, work pretty much for 4 days non-stop, about 15 hours a day, and then go off elsewhere for 6 days just to manage to complete the audiobook, sorry. And I did that, and that was non-stop work for about 11 days, and it was really, really tough and challenging. And when I came back home, I was obviously absolutely exhausted. But I still managed to carry on making videos. I think I had 1 day off because I was just absolutely out of it. But just all the constant non-stop work really burnt me out for a little bit because they were long, long days. So yesterday, I really needed a break. I really needed some family time as well. Hadn't had that in a while. And today, I mean, I really tried, but I'm still feeling not the best. But I didn't want to leave you guys another night without anything to listen to, so I hope you didn't mind the compilation too much. I really like Skinwalker stories, and I was saving it for a special day, so I hope you guys liked it. We're back to our regular programming tomorrow, and henceforth, I have a really, really, really fun video that I'm super keen on releasing with a very good friend of mine, so I really hope you guys come back tomorrow because I'm really looking forward to releasing this. But anyway, sorry that I kept talking so much at the end of the video. Hopefully you just kind of understand what's been going on. The audiobook itself was approved, so the little sampler I gave got the green light, so I'm going to try and submit everything by tomorrow morning, and hopefully soon you guys will be able to check it out. And thanks everyone for showing your support in the comment section, saying how excited you are for it. I'm really excited for it. I just really hope that enough people, well, that you guys get it and a lot of you can listen to it, because, well, I really liked it and I really hope you guys like it too. But anyway, enough of this. I'm going to let you guys go now because I haven't stopped talking. So anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.